For many, many years of my life, I was a writer and an editor. And many, many people during those years asked for my advice on how they could be better writers, how they could rewrite and improve specific books, specific stories, specific chapters of text, whether that be fiction or nonfiction. And very often I was paid to do that job. Then above and beyond that, people who were my friends or colleagues or acquaintances asked for that kind of help with my writing. Very often, just because they had read something I'd written and they regarded me as an extraordinarily talented or experienced writer myself. Sometimes it was because they knew I actually had professional experience with both writing and editing. In the last 5 years, quite unexpectedly from my perspective, writing ceased to be a significant part of my life. Editing other people's writing ceased to be an important part of my life. And instead, step by step, the format of the YouTube video, especially the YouTube video monologue, became my main creative outlet, became the way I express my ideas to the world. That's even the main way I hear back from other people about their ideas about the world. Nobody asks for my advice on how they can make a better YouTube video. Nobody. Now, one interpretation of this would be, well, gee, Eisel, maybe that's because you were actually a talented writer and you have no talent at all for acting or performing or making YouTube. Maybe. That's one possibility. But I have another idea that cuts deeper. And I just mentioned these two explanations actually are compatible. They're not mutually exclusive. So if you think I'm terrible at making YouTube videos or doing monologues, don't worry. This analysis could work for you. Making YouTube videos, many people think of as something much more immediate, much more intimate, much more authentic than professional writing for publication. Something separate from writing in a diary, writing for your own satisfaction, or writing a private letter, something that's only meant to be read by one person, this sort of thing. Now, I really felt the contrast when I worked as a professional editor. The contrast between dealing with the French and dealing with any other culture of people, whether that be Americans, British, Burmese, Thai, Chinese, Vietnamese, Filipinos. I dealt with many, many nationalities of author when I was an editor. The French, and the French alone, among all the cultures I dealt with, they had this powerful conviction that whatever they wrote remained a kind of testimony as to the particular mood and particular frame of mind they happened to be in at the time they wrote it. It was only the French who ever said to me, when I was in the role of a professional editor, who said, look, I don't care if this is right or if it's wrong. That was how I was how I was feeling on that day when I wrote it. That's how the text should stand, reflecting whatever I was going through, whatever mood I was in at that time. And it was only to the French that I had to say back, look, this is a professional nonfiction publishing house. We're not publishing your memoirs. We're not publishing your poetry. This is not about your feelings. We're doing the fact checking. And if the facts are wrong, it's not going to be published. If there are problems in the text, as an editor, I'm going to solve them. And either you're going to address them or your chapter is going to be deleted or the page is going to be deleted, whatever it is. And I think what's really instructive there is that French attitude, and by the way, I'm not claiming all French people have this attitude, but obviously I was dealing with a certain type of person who had a PhD or high level of accomplishment within a technical area. This is not representative of all people, but these are the French people I dealt with as authors. That French attitude is much closer to the attitude that most YouTubers have, people who speak English language and make YouTube videos. They feel like the YouTube video should just record however they were feeling in that particular day. They don't want to think about the composition of the YouTube video as something they cerebrally, rationally put together as a performance for an audience, right? So they're thinking of YouTube videos more like a diary or more like a private personal letter sent from one person to another, or they're even thinking of it like security camera footage, right? instead of thinking of it in the same category as writing an essay, writing a book chapter, writing something for an audience that serves a purpose, something that really exists to communicate to that audience. So I think this is actually the deeper reason as to why nobody has ever asked me for advice on how to make a YouTube video or how to make their own YouTube videos better. I have never been asked for that advice, not even from other YouTubers whom I know have a lot of appreciation for the videos on my channel, who either admire me as a person or who really admire my videos, or people who've written into me saying this video or that video changed their life profoundly, where they really are fans of my content. So even if my content is objectively terrible, these are people who subjectively think my videos are really great, but they don't think to ask for my advice because they don't think of the composition of a YouTube video as an act of authorship in that same sense. They think of it as this spontaneous, personal outpouring of emotion or feelings or reflections and capturing that particular moment. And interestingly, in my experience, French authors in particular feel that way too, sometimes, about the written word, about publishing essays, book chapters, so on and so forth. Much younger YouTuber got started up called ODS. He's a fan of the channel, and I'm a fan of his. He made his first his first video in English, I should add, talking about the ancient philosophy of Plato as set down in the Gorgias. And watching that video immediately reminded me of the advice that I've given to aspiring authors in the past when dealing with their writing. And of course, it didn't remind me of advice I've given on YouTube videos. I haven't given any advice on YouTube videos in this sense, right? So something I've done when sitting down with authors and talking about their manuscripts, and keep in mind, a lot of these manuscripts were maybe written first as a PhD thesis or some kind of academic formal essay. I would always say to them, what I'm trying to avoid here is a narration of generalities. If we stop and think about it, a lot of academic writing is a narration of generalities. And, if I would sometimes ask them, okay, in these 5 pages, what are you doing here? What's the point of this text? And someone would say, well, I'm trying to summarize this, and this. And I say, no summary. We don't publish summaries. So if it's a summary, just delete that entire. That's not going to press, right? So what's the point? What are you getting to? And very often in talking to the authors, or just in reading the text, just in starting with that, you'd come to a point in the text where they may say out loud, they may just say in the writing, this is really interesting. There's like a pause, there's a punctuation, there's a stop, and say, wow, this is really interesting. And I would stop them and say to them, hey, why isn't that the title of the article? Or why isn't that the title of the chapter? Why didn't you write an article about that? Get rid of the summary, get rid of the narration of generalities. If that's what's interesting, that's what you want to write about. And then something I said again and again to other writers was, think about your audience. You're writing this, you're not writing this for yourself, you're writing this to communicate to an audience. So you have to tell them, this is what I'm going to tell you. This is why I'm telling you. And now this is why it matters. Brief digression here. I'm going to come back to ODS and his video about Plato. There are some topics, I would say, especially when you are debunking a misconception, when the answer to those 3 or 4 questions is implicitly obvious, right? So let's say you do a video on how the Americans won in World War II. Specifically how the Americans beat the Japanese in World War II, I'm going to say, okay? You probably do not have to explain to your audience that World War II is an important event or that's an important question. And you may be able to just in a single sentence communicate the fact most people assume that the invention of the atom bomb, nuclear weapons, that was the crucial factor that allowed the United States to defeat Japan in World War II. But I'm going to debunk that notion. I'm going to tell you that this is what really mattered instead, that there's something else, there's a different factor that matters. So when you have that format, when you have a debunking format, debunking a misconception about something where the audience already knows why it's important, that makes you unaware of the obligation on the author or the creative artist or actor or performer here on YouTube to explain to the audience, hey, this is what I'm telling you about today. This is why it matters, et cetera, to really go over those bases. So you can imagine, by contrast, there's a huge burden for me to explain to you why it matters and why you should be interested. If even just by contrast, I'm going to tell you about what happened in Cambodia during World War II. Like, hey, did you know, whether it's Cambodia or maybe Myanmar, there's this whole other history of what happened in World War II in Cambodia. There's this whole other history of what happened in Myanmar. And of course, it wasn't decisive for the beginning, middle, or end of World War II, but it's interesting or important in some other sense that I have to get across to you. I have to tell you why I'm telling this to you, what I'm going to prove. In plain English, you have to explain to the audience what is the point. And again, the greatest enemy of having a point is the narration of generalities. The greatest enemy of having a point is a summary, right? And that's very counterintuitive. Even those two examples, you might think, well, okay, the way to do that video is to start by giving a summary of what happened in World War II, whether it's in Japan or Cambodia or Myanmar. No, right? That's a waste of everyone's time, including your own, right? So discarding the summary mindset, discarding the narration of generalities mindset. No, there's a specific question that I'm going to answer. Here's what the question is. Here's what I'm telling you. Here's why I'm telling you. Here's the answer, right? Problem and problem solving attitude. And if there are many problems, you should have many chapters or possibly many separate books, depending on many essays, whatever it is, right? But to start thinking in these terms, this is what's going to make your writing accessible and interesting, and this is what's going to make your YouTube videos accessible and interesting, because ultimately it's making your communication of ideas functional. It's making it outcome driven instead of being narration of generalities driven, instead of being thought of in terms of telling a story that existed in your imagination before you came here to tell it. That's the wrong way to think, where you're narrating or summarizing someone else's story. No. You're starting from a blank piece of paper and you're telling a story no one's ever heard before, because it's your story that you've made up starting from a blank piece of paper. Right? Like my specific thesis about why America beat Japan in World War II, that's a new story. That's something you haven't heard, something you haven't thought of before. And it's maybe something you didn't even realize you were interested in until I pointed it out to you. Hey, you assumed it's because of the atom bomb. It's not really. It's not as important as there are these other factors you don't know about. Okay? Now you're interested. Now you're on my page. And if you're not interested, you'll click on another YouTube video, or you wouldn't read that book, you wouldn't read that paper, what have you. So when I'm watching this video by ODS, again, much younger guy, he's just getting started making YouTube videos, right? He's doing a narration of generalities. He's giving a summary. He's basically just summarizing this text from Plato and narrating this text in general terms. What happens to, and I would say at 3 points, maybe at 4 points, he stops and he kind of dramatically pauses and even looks at the camera. And he says, more or less plainly, this is really interesting. This is really important, right? That should be the video. That moment should have been when you start the video. That should be the topic of the video. And it could be 3 separate videos. It could be 4 separate videos, right? Everything else is going to go. That point, and you should tell me why it's interesting, and that's what you got to make a video about. So to give an example, one portion of the video, he's going on and on, narrative, summary, and then he stops, and you can actually feel the dramatic tension in his voice when he reads out a passage where Socrates kind of turns a corner, and Socrates says, hey, you know what? He thinks of himself not merely as a politician and not merely as a great politician, but as the only true politician in the whole history of Athens. That all the other politicians are frauds, that only Socrates is a real political leader or politician. And you can see this young guy, ODS, he's saying, this is a big deal. This is interesting. And he just briefly comments, this might relate to some other issues and some other texts where Socrates is a little bit of megalomania. That's a topic for a video. All right. Now, what's the hook? People say Socrates was a philosopher. He thought of himself as a politician. Right? And he thought of himself as the only true politician, and all the other politicians are frauds. Now I'm interested. Now you've got a story to tell, and it's your story. It's your narrative. It's not summarizing what the text already says. It's not narrating in more general terms what the text says, right? That's your story because you picked it out. You noticed it. You reacted to it. And you could even start by saying how that made you feel. That's a great way to start a YouTube video. You could start the YouTube video saying, hypothetically, I was always told that Socrates was a philosopher. I was told that he talked about the meaning of life, and he talked about religion, and he talked about duty and honoring your parents. I was given this vision of Socrates as a man who suffered for philosophy and died for philosophy. And I thought of him as quite a passive character. I thought of him as someone who had nothing to do with politics, someone who just stood there in the marketplace and kind of chit-chatted with people. And, I had this idea of Socrates from school. And you know what? When I came to this point, when I was reading this text by Plato, I suddenly realized just how wrong all of that was, that this guy really was a political philosopher. Now, this links to another point in the specific text. Repeatedly, Socrates makes this joke. He's talking to his enemy or his opponent. And he says, you love the demos, which is a play on words, meaning the people in general. And there's also a particular guy named Demos. And Socrates says of himself, whereas I love Alcibiades, right? And this is linked to what he's saying about his political program. Alcibiades was a political leader, including a military leader, and he was very specifically the political leader and military leader that Socrates groomed to take over government, to take over the leadership of Athens, right? So this whole notion we have of Socrates as this kind of passive man of peace, hippie wearing sandals who just hung out in the marketplace and asked people witty questions and repartee and picked their brains. There's all this crap people say about Socrates, as if he was like a stand-up comedian. Or I've even heard someone say he was the original internet troll, that he was just stimulating people this way. The image of the gadfly. No. This is telling you in a stone-cold serious manner that Socrates is, in his way, a political radical or revolutionary. And it's also very shocking, if you take the time to unpack it, the fact that he has no respect at all for these other political leaders who are named from that era of Athens and from decades and centuries before. That he's saying, no, these other guys you worship as having been like the Winston Churchill of your society, or as having been the Abraham Lincoln of your society. I regard all those guys as a fraud. And he says that he only regards himself as a... So now we've got a topic. But this is my ultimate point. Really what I'm presenting here isn't even my opinion of what that YouTube video should be. And you could say this also about an essay, a book chapter, whatever it may be. If you just watch that video by ODS and you pay attention to the moments where he stops and he says, in effect, hey, this is really interesting. This is surprising to me. You can hear it in his voice, see what he says. You can actually just present an analysis of that video, and those moments of tension within it already emerge and show you what, even from his perspective, not from my perspective, but from the creative artist's own perspective, what that video could or should be.